Welcome to this video tutorial with Virtual Racing School for the Blancpain series on iRacing. This week takes us to the unforgiving and daunting Mount Panorama circuit in Bathurst, where I'll be looking at a lap driven by Rens Broekman in the Mercedes AMG GT3, which is driven in default afternoon weather to match the official series. I'll play the lap in full for you first before then going into further analysis. Okay, so that was a 2-minute 3.394. Starting things off then as ever from the list of data packs on the VRS website, we're going to choose the Mercedes AMG GT3 from Rens Broekman. We're going to choose week 11. It loads up the session details where you can, as ever, download the lap files to compare your driving in sim, the replay and the race setup. We're going to click on Learn Track, which will load up the driving analyzer. We'll start to play the lap through. I'm just going to pause it and explain what we can see. So there are some additional overlays from VRS. You've got the steering angle input here, you've got the speed of the car, you've got brake and throttle inputs, live driving inputs and the sectors at the top. So what I'm going to do here is just mute it first, slow it to half speed to make it easier to explain and play it through. Now obviously this is the start finish straight. You need to be thinking about your braking point, which is going to be between the 100 marker on the right hand side and the 50. Now it's worth noting that this first corner, turn 1, hell corner it's called, is all about the exit. So you've got a really long straight, so the exit speed through here is absolutely critical, so don't worry about overdriving the entry. It's far more important to really nail the exit. So we can see here that Rens is fairly careful on the brakes, peaks at about 70-80%, which is threshold in this car. You don't want to be braking any harder than that. And then he bleeds off as he turns in quite nicely. A fairly straightforward corner really. It's just quite important that you are precise on the apex. You don't want to hit this curb. You want a nice, clean, neat and tidy exit with decent exit speed. So he picks up the throttle as he apexes, doesn't overcommit too early. We are in second gear, so there's a decent amount of torque at the rear wheels. We don't want to overcome the traction available, and we want to open the car up and use all of the circuit. Now it's kind of debatable as to whether or not it's quicker to use this curb. I think with the Mercedes it is, just because it allows you to open up the corner even though it can destabilize the car slightly. So just be aware of that and keep the car nice and straight. So I'm going to skip forward down towards the end of Mountain Straight. Obviously, just bring the car ever so gradually over to the left hand side. Try and scrub as little speed as possible as you climb the hill, and then your braking reference into Griffin's Bend here is going to be where this white painted wall begins. And you can afford to brake really aggressively here, even though it's quite a high speed corner, primarily because it's uphill. So you can see again, Rens peaks at about 70% brake pressure, gets his braking done quite early on before turning in and bleeding off. Now, it's worth me pointing out, it's super important that you don't turn in too late into this corner and that you don't coast, because you tend to get understeer. It's quite cambered in towards the apex, but it's actually slightly off camber if you run wide. So it's super important that you get your line right on entry and you hug this curb all the way around. Again, making sure that you don't actually make contact with the curb, because it's quite tall and it will destabilize the car. So I just want to point out here, Rens did initially come off the brakes, presumably because the car rotated into the corner quite nicely, but then he got back on the brakes to stop it from washing out. So that's just nicely balancing the car. It's able to pick up the throttle much more aggressively than exiting turn 1, because we're in third gear, higher speed, and also it's uphill, so you can really get on the power quite hard. Just be aware that if you are carrying too much speed here and you are starting to run wide on this curb, it can be quite unsettling, so just be aware of that and be prepared to lift slightly or feather out of the throttle if necessary. Bring the car over to right hand side as you turn in towards the cutting. Now it's flatter out as you turn in, but then as you apex next to this first wall on entry, you want to be off the throttle at that point, or even just before. And we can see that Rens applies the brakes extremely cautiously into this corner, and the reason for that is the whole braking zone is pretty much a corner, so you really can't afford to brake anywhere near as aggressively as the previous two corners, otherwise you'll probably destabilize the car, go sideways, and end up in this wall on the outside. So play it through. So he's allowed the car to just wander towards the wall because he's in control. He's not braking too aggressively. He's got the car slowed down enough before the first apex, and now he's able to bring the car back in, hooked up into this camber, hugging this inside wall. That's really important that you get as close to this inside wall as possible. That's pretty close. And then you pick up the throttle as you apex. Now, the grip that you have in the corner itself will diminish very quickly as you exit the corner, because the circuit kind of crests over the top and you lose that camber. So you can see that Rens is having to be quite careful with the throttle application, and you just saw some steering corrections which you can see more clearly in the steering trace here. So just be aware of that, be willing to lift and make corrections to settle the rear end for oversteer if necessary. And then it's going to be the same again through here, this next right-hander, where you want to be close to the wall on the inside, you want to be feathering out of the throttle, and you want to be anticipating, pretty much expecting oversteer. Just there, more oversteer for Rens, which is, yeah, very normal. And again, you need to be willing to be out of the throttle when that happens, so that you don't end up too sideways. So allow the car all the way up to the wall on the outside as you head into Reed Park. And then this is probably one of the most exhilarating sections on the track. It's really just about line and then commitment. So Rens has taken a small lift. Well, it's actually a considerable lift, but he's not completely come out of the throttle. And he's got his line nicely set up. He's fairly close to this inside wall. This curb will protect you to some extent from hitting the wall, so you can get close to that one, but then this one is also got a curb, but it's lower, so you really need to be careful, and the circuit will kind of throw you out over to the left hand side as it's off camber at this point. So just be aware of that. We do actually see a slight confidence lift in the throttle trace from Rens, but it didn't really cost him any time at all. It's all about maintaining momentum, really. So down the hill, aiming for, I guess, if you need a reference, this second sponsor logo from the end, and you want to be sort of sighting your apex quite early on. So you want to be judging your distance to this outside wall in your peripheral, and this is going to be pretty much when you need to lift. So you need to be lifting at the bottom of the hill, in the dip basically, and then as you climb up again, you want to be turning in quite hard. You get plenty of grip as the car compresses into the circuit up the hill, and then you really need to just be controlling the throttle, feathering the throttle ever so slightly, and trying to judge when you think you're going to be as close to this wall without actually clouting it. Now we saw some pretty intense oversteer there. Now Rens arguably has a little bit too much throttle at this point, is slightly too committed, and has to make a big correction for oversteer. Now in a longer stint, that's probably going to increase tyre wear, so you want to avoid that if possible. But fortunately Rens gets away with it, and you do have this curb which just protects you ever so slightly from hitting this wall. But as you can see from the tyre marks on the wall, that many people have hit it in the past. And then you want to stay against the wall on entry. This is Solomon Park, and you want to turn in quite early here. It's quite deceiving how early you need to turn in. You want to be lifting as you turn in, and you don't want to miss this entry point because the circuit drops away, so you actually lose grip as you turn in, and it's not until the apex when you get some grip back. So you want to be aiming for this curb on the inside, and then throughout the exit you want to be feathering the throttle because it feels like it tightens up through the exit, and you've got this curb which is really tall on the exit. Now Rens has actually hit this curb, but he's got the car nice and straight at that point and was at part throttle just prior to hitting it, so he's just able to keep the car settled enough, keep the car straight enough to not be upset by it. And then down the hill then into Skyline, through Skyline, and then into the S's, ultimately the dipper. You can see that here Rens does actually brake ever so slightly as he crests the hill, just feeling it out, doesn't want to carry too much speed. It's very important that you are neat and tidy through here, and just try and maintain momentum rather than going in really hot and braking super hard. So Rens' peak brake pressure here is only about 50% and never any more. And we can actually see several brake inputs from him. So we're entering in fourth gear. You want to be close to this wall, and you want to be looking at this tree, trying to spot the apex curb, and you want to be braking just before this curb. And then you want to be slightly off the brakes as you ride the curb, because the curb can unsettle the car. And then as the curb finishes, you want to be back on the brakes again. You want to take advantage of when the car is at its most settled to be harder on the brakes. So you really need to get the car slowed down quite a lot through here. Down into second gear, hug this inside wall on entry. And then the circuit really drops away through the dipper, and you want to be aiming for this inside wall, expecting the grip to fall off, which normally pushes you slightly wide. So you want to try and anticipate that. It will take some practice, of course, and you can afford to pick up the throttle as you land, because the car will grip up, and then you should have decent grip here, even though you need to sort of anticipate again that the car might oversteer. So it's really important that you've worked on your car control prior to driving quickly here, because it can really bite you. So close to the wall on the left as you approach the braking into Forest Elbow, probably the most difficult braking on the circuit. So you want to brake actually slightly before turning into the first right-hander, because otherwise you'll arrive down the hill with too much speed and you won't have the chance to brake and slow the car down enough. So Rens has shaved a little bit of speed off on entry just to keep the car more stable, and then just as he crests down the hill he increases that brake pressure again, and he's able to keep the car nice and stable. Now the circuit will continue to fall away all the way through the apex, so it's another corner where you really need to turn in quite early and hold the brakes on all the way into the apex so you don't run wide. This corner is really important for your exit, so you really want to make sure you got the rotation into the apex so that when you pick up the throttle, and you do have decent grip here but the car will understeer, so you want to make sure that you got the rotation so that when you pick up the throttle you don't understeer wide into that wall. Down through Conrod Straight now, obviously just keep the car over to the left hand side and take a bit of a breather. Up over the hill, in towards the chase, you do actually want to, on approach, bring the car over to the left hand side just to open up the kink before the chase, and then you want to think about braking, which is going to be at about, I'll just show you, it's the marker before the 100, this 150. So probably the heaviest braking zone on the whole circuit, probably carrying the most amount of speed, and the car will actually grip up under braking because the circuit starts to climb back uphill slightly. And get the car slowed down. Try not to turn in with too much speed. Make sure that you've slowed the car down enough before you turn in, and then hold those brakes. You will get a little bit of understeer on entry, and you want to get as close to this curb here on the inside as possible without making contact with it. Most of the curbs at this circuit are quite aggressive, so that will apply in several places. Pick up the throttle as you apex. Expect a bit of oversteer, a bit more oversteer there for Rens, and then try and keep the car nice and settled, hugging this curb through the right-hander as the circuit opens up. And normally if you get your line right, you can maintain this flat out. Into the final corner on the circuit then, Murray's corner. Your braking marker will be this 100 meter marker, just after there in fact. Fairly straightforward 90-degree left-hander. Fairly balanced in terms of priority, so entry is kind of equally as important as exit, so you can afford to tack the entry a little bit more than turn 1, for example. You really want to get close to this curb on the inside, again avoiding contact with it. Pick up the throttle nice and early. Good bit of hesitation here from Rens. I would argue maybe that he picked up the throttle slightly too soon, and wants a nice clean exit, more importantly. What I would say, in contrast with turn 1, you can't really afford to run wide here through the exit, because there the curb is much narrower and the grass will really cost you in terms of traction. And there we are, that completes a lap at Bathurst. You can find all setups, replays and telemetry for your own use and analysis on virtualracingschool.com, where you can also book coaching including group classes with world champions from the likes of Koan and Simsport. Good luck for this week, and feel free to post any questions or comments below. Thanks for watching.